Thank you all so very much for joining us today for this first of our virtual Lunch and Learn series. Thank you very much to Professor Faizer and to Professor Harris, who are joining us from LMU Law. The professors teach constitutional law at Lincoln Memorial University at the Duncan School of Law, and we are grateful they are willing to share with us their expertise and knowledge about the intersection of protesting government action and the First Amendment. We are attempting to stream this live on Facebook because there was a concern that more people would be wanting to join us than who could fit within the confines of the space on this webinar. We don't know if that's actually happening or not, so please conduct yourselves accordingly. So again, I'd like to begin by introducing Professor Faizer. Professor Faizer, is there anything you'd like to share with us today?
Oh, just the only thing is my appreciation for being here and for your all of your interest, I think civic-minded interest in the subject matter. So I'm very honored to be here.
And Professor?
Yeah, what he said.
Thank you so very much for joining us today. We have a couple of questions that have been submitted to us in advance, and we do have a question and answer forum available for folks who are participating with this webinar. My clerk, Stephanie Heron, will be monitoring the chat and will feed me questions that come up in chat through my cell phone because there's just too much tech going on right now for me to juggle everything successfully. All right, so let's begin our conversation today by asking, what does the US Constitution say about protesting government action? Professor Faizer, would you care to begin?
Well, it doesn't say anything directly. There's the word protest is nowhere there, but it refers to protests by implication in the First Amendment, where it says basically that the government, by implication, cannot suppress speech or their ability to either petition the government or to assemble. So those three things are set forth in the First Amendment, right? And what it means is that the government can't suppress speech, especially political speech such as this, which is the most important as far as the framers were concerned, most compelling speech. But it also can't deny people the right to assemble and get together and collectively enunciate speech. Because for two reasons. One is when people assemble and enunciate speech, people take the perspective more seriously because they're strengthening numbers. But two is it creates an awareness by people that their perspectives are worthy of enunciation because they're not so discrete and insular as to be suppressible. And the example that I gave you, Ms. Maples, was initially after 9/11 when we were on our path to the Iraq War. I myself was opposed to the war because I couldn't see the nexus the Bush administration had or the British government had between the attacks of 9/11 and attacking Saddam Hussein's, albeit murderous, regime. And so I felt, though, uncomfortable to protest or enunciate my opposition because I very much thought that the public was unprepared to hear a message that they might see as insensitive to the victims of 9/11. But sure enough, as the protests started manifesting, I was aware that the American public was more sophisticated on the issue than I perhaps gave them credit for on the front end. And I myself started speaking up more forthrightly against the war. So those are the key things that it's in our First Amendment. The other thing is from Article 1 in our Constitution, it denies the government the ability to unilaterally suspend the writ of habeas corpus. So unlike a country like France, where the president of the republic can declare a state of emergency, in the United States, the president of the United States can't detain people incommunicado without justifying their detention before an impartial magistrate. And only in cases of invasion or rebellion can you do that, and only Congress can legally do that. And so in our country, you can't, like in France or Italy or the United Kingdom at times, merely round people up. Think of the term, right? Round up the usual suspects, right? You can't do that constitutionally in our country. Those are our great protections against arbitrary abuses of the state. Professor Harris?
Yes, I would add only one thing, that only Congress can suspend habeas corpus, and of course, Abraham Lincoln. So if you are Abraham Lincoln, you can unilaterally suspend habeas corpus, at least if there's a civil war going on. All kidding aside, the only amendment that I would have to what Professor Faizer says is that although speech and press are often conflated, and there functionally is very little, if any, difference between the analysis a court would use, I think that recent events show us that there has been, apparently, a specific violation by the government against the press on more than one occasion. When CNN camera crews got arrested, although they'd identified themselves, when the Australian camera crew was attacked in Lafayette Square. And so if they bring actions, and I suspect that they will, it will probably be brought under not only the speech clause, but the press clause of the First Amendment.
Okay, and that was going to be my next follow-up question. At what point do constitutional protections end when it comes to the freedom of speech? Because a lot of what we're seeing right now, particularly in protests involving government action, are physical manifestations of anger and rage and just people being done with the status quo. Is our freedom of speech protected when we're using physical expressions such as marching or engaging in nonverbal or non-print forms of expression?
I'll jump in on this one, though of course, Professor Faizer, feel free to come in and correct me as appropriate. There's an old expression that is not technically legal analysis, but is nonetheless cited from time to time by the courts, and I think captures in a nutshell the concept here. And it goes like this, that your right to swing your arm ends where your fist connects with my nose. And so yes, many, many things that we do, from marching to carrying signs to having certain t-shirts to engaging in certain actions like lying down in the street or taking a knee, for example. This is all expressive conduct. And by and large, as long as you are not endangering other people, certainly as long as you're not attacking other people, those are going to be considered protected speech. And so there's a wide range of expression that is protected by the First Amendment.
Professor Faizer, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I would second exactly what Professor Harris said. Be mindful, though, of this, right? Which is some forms of expressive conduct tend to be unpopular. So it's as far as the Supreme Court's concerned, burning the American flag is First Amendment protected expressive conduct. Mm-hmm. It's greatly unpopular with the public and so I think the difficulty is in this situation, how do you maintain the right to protest, which we discussed is protected in our system of government, without being forced into, perhaps being goaded into at times, if you're a protester, forms of expressive conduct to garner attention that lose the public sympathy, right? So the obvious examples would be, in my mind, is contrast the civil rights struggle in the early 1960s under the aegis of Dr. King, which always were on the right side of peace and protest, and then how the public viewed the at times riots of the late 1960s, right? And the late 1960s, I think, was the moment where I think many Americans lost sympathy with what they perceived as riots that characterized the civil rights movement, when I think some of that was they were being goaded into that action. Fair enough, Professor Harris?
Well, very fair. I've seen in a lot of online discussions people saying something along these lines: just because you have the right to say something doesn't mean that it's a good idea to do so. And so that's a matter of practical politics. And if you do want to protest, if you want to become part of one of these protests, I would suggest that you very carefully consider how you will be perceived. And I think Professor Faizer has identified what's perhaps the best example of that, and that is the early marches in the 50s and 60s down at Selma and elsewhere, where under the aegis of Dr. King and under his guidance, people were deliberately and intentionally and always nonviolent, and would even dress up in suits and ties and nice dresses. And this was all intentional. They wanted to look as respectable as possible and give their tormentors as little excuse as possible. And when in fact the dogs were sicked upon them, they were extremely sympathetic.
Okay. And that brings us to the next question of, at what point does a protest cross the line from being protected by the First Amendment to not being protected by the First Amendment?
When it's no longer peaceable, because that's exactly what the First Amendment says, the right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. As long as the people are peaceable, then they are protected. As soon as they start throwing water bottles, I'm sorry to say, as soon as they act in a way, certainly throwing rocks or doing anything else that, perhaps they feel justified in doing, when the police are lobbing tear gas canisters at them, at that point, they've probably crossed some sort of line, and they'd have to justify that behavior or some form of self-defense, which in a melee is very difficult to do. So just stay peaceable and you should be fine.
So who decides what defines peaceable action?
An independent magistrate, as Professor Faizer mentioned before. The police are not going to side with you in a situation like that. So the best thing you can do, I realize I'm skipping ahead here to the end of your questions. If you find yourself in such a situation, don't resist, physically don't resist. Don't try to provoke the police. If you are detained, ask for a lawyer immediately. Ask for a lawyer. You might also ask, why am I being detained? But just ask for a lawyer. And once that happens, you should get a lawyer fairly soon. And then finally, if you're preparing to go to such an event, I would suggest bringing along a friend who has a nice cell phone camera, so that you can all cover each other and film whatever interactions happen with the police. And that could be extraordinarily important evidence later on if you are charged with some sort of violation.
Okay. In the past few weeks, we've seen protests handled differently by government actors. There have been the more recent marches as a call to action against racism. But prior to that, there were protests against government action involving COVID-19 protection measures that resulted in storming the Michigan State Capitol with firearms. And so there were different responses by government actors to each of these occurrences. So in your opinion, what is your take on the difference in how these protests were handled?
Professor Faizer, you want to jump in on this one?
I think it's heterodox. We're a country of 4,078 jurisdictions, last I checked, right? And most of these protests are being dealt with by local law enforcement. There's very few federal law enforcement officials. This is largely done by local law enforcement. And I think the unfortunate reality is there are people in power who have every incentive to claim that this is a riot and an insurrection as opposed to a lawful protest. That is the problem. And they are aided by media that have every incentive to, financial incentive that is, to further that narrative.
And so what I think I'm hearing you say is that these protests were handled differently because the politics on a local level are not uniform and there's not a unified response on the local level. Is that correct?
No, I would say it's hard to characterize the protest monographically. I think some protesters have just been, the vast majority have just sought to enunciate their grievance. And I think the vast majority of police officers and local law enforcement officials have handled it properly. I think, though, there have been riots, right? There have been acts of violence, acts of vandalism. The problem is, I think that's excessively highlighted by those who don't like the message of the protesters.
I think that's probably, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, not at all.
That's probably true. And I'd also like to say, along with Professor Faizer, that the vast majority of cops are good people. Indeed, I consider them heroes. They put themselves in harm's way to protect us. But we've seen in recent weeks, haven't we, that there are more than just a few bad apples out there. And I think all of us can agree, including good police officers, that we want to be rid of the bad police officers. And we definitely have a struggle ahead of us. To get back to your question, what about the differential in treatment? I agree with Professor Faizer that it's so fragmented, heterodox in our nation that it's difficult to come up with one reaction to it. But on the other hand, I think there's a fairly clear difference that most of us can probably agree upon, and that is that those protesters taking their AR-15s into the Michigan State Capitol, which, as a fellow who was born and raised in Michigan, I find absurd, is part of Michigan law. They showed up with semi-automatic rifles, theoretically could have been loaded with great big magazines and perhaps even armor-piercing shells in them that could go through the police officers' protective gear. And they walked right in there and then started screaming in the faces of those police officers who just stood there. Well, good for them. I mean, you know, not the gun part, but good for the police for showing restraint. I mean, police should show restraint, and it's a very challenging thing. But look at the other situations where peaceful Black protesters, or predominantly Black, and their allies are marching in the streets unarmed, and how somehow the reaction to that becomes far more aggressive on the part of the police. Ask yourself this hypothetical and answer it for yourself. If those protesters at the Michigan State Capitol with their semi-automatic assault rifles had been Black, do you think that the police would have been quite as restrained? We'll never know, but I think a lot of people probably have a strong feeling about that.
Maybe.
Agreed. So the next question on our agenda today is, what is the Insurrection Act?
Professor Harris, do you want to give that a go first?
Sure. It's a statute enacted in 1807. There were precursor statutes, but basically this was the statute that allows the national government to federalize, I believe is the term, the state militias. And this is specifically to be done only in times of great peril, preferably at the behest, at the invitation of a state government. So the state of Wyoming, for example, could say, hey, we've got a real problem here, Mr. President. Could you please send us some federal troops here and help us out with it? Or if the state government's unable to make such an invitation, or maybe unwilling, but the insurrection is serious enough, the president can unilaterally declare that an insurrection is in progress and can actually send in federal troops. Now, this is an extraordinary power, and it runs directly counter to some of the main concerns of the people at the Constitutional Convention, who were scared by the entire idea of a standing army and being controlled by the national government. But on the other hand, it was a practical recognition of a power that ideally should be used only in the most extreme circumstances. It's been used a number of times, more than a dozen, I believe, in our history. Most recently after the Rodney King riots in California, but that was done at the invitation of California, and therefore California didn't object. But it was done earlier during the Civil Rights era. Probably the most famous exercise of this power was at Little Rock, where the President Eisenhower confronted a governor who was openly defying a federal court order to desegregate Little Rock High. And so he said, he nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, then sent them back to their barracks, and then he sent in the 101st Airborne, and they took care of business. So it has been used. It has been used for some very good reasons over the years. It could also be used for very bad reasons. It's a very powerful power, and one to be used very, very rarely and very sparingly and with great deliberation.
So what are the checks on using the Insurrection Act to control the United States populace?
The ballot box.
So
it's also political culture, right? We don't use the Insurrection Act in this country for the reasons Professor Harris said. But remember what an insurrection is about. It's about a challenge to the government. In other words, it's there to protect against a coup d'etat. Think of Russia, right? The Bolshevik Revolution, right? That's what it's there to protect against, not to make life more easy for a sitting president facing embarrassing protesters outside the White House, right? That's the difference.
There's that. Go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, the real hard question we have to discuss, which we struggle with today, is to what degree is the political culture of the country in flux? Such that when I say something to you and Professor Harris, that the major constraint on abuse of something like the Insurrection Act is the political culture, to what degree is what I am saying manifesting a level of naivete, right, as to the current state of affairs? I don't know.
I don't know either, but I do note, and to build upon what Professor Faizer just said, that we've seen some remarkable resistance to the invocation of the Insurrection Act, haven't we? We've seen the president federalize the DC National Guard, which wasn't that big a step given that DC is already part, in some sense, of the national government. We saw the president request other states to send their National Guard troops in, and I believe 5,000 troops from Tennessee were dispatched within 24 hours. But by the time most of those troops arrived, most of the bad things had happened in Lafayette Square and beyond, and very soon thereafter, the president reversed himself and sent those troops home. So our National Guard is back in Tennessee now. So that happened because of the public outcry, but I think going along with that has been the extraordinary reaction of senior military officers, both active duty and retired, who have come out unanimously, as far as I've seen, and said this is absolutely inappropriate. We should not be used against our own people for a variety of reasons, but the paramount reason is, of course, that it is very much a threat to the constitutional order and should only be done in the most extreme of circumstances. And for heaven's sake, even if you put the worst light on these protests and you emphasize the looting and the damage that's done, it's been very, very minor. I mean, I'm not aware of anybody who's actually lost his life because of the rioters. A few people have lost their lives because of the police. A few buildings have been damaged, and that's bad. But seriously, is this an insurrection that justifies calling in the 82nd Airborne? I think that's what's happened here. I note, however, that our current president still seems to be spoiling for a fight, and he just read this morning in the paper, he said he wants to send federal troops into Seattle because the protesters there are protesting. And the Seattle mayor's response was, if you'd like to help, Mr. President, go back to your bunker. So using the Insurrection Act when the local government doesn't want you to do so is the most controversial use of that act. That's the president acting entirely on his own authority. And again, I think the ultimate reaction to that we're already seeing throughout the country, and that's why I say the ballot box is the ultimate check on that sort of presidential power.
When we talk about insurrection, is keeping in mind that some members of our audience are not law students nor lawyers, is there a definition of what defines an insurrection? Are there check marks that we need to make sure that are hit before we rise to the level of what's defined as an insurrection?
No, but the case law is pretty clear in this regard. The primary invocation of the Insurrection Act occurred in 1861, when, guess what? There were a number of states who were in open rebellion, engaged in an insurrection against the authority of the United States government. That's the level of threat that this act was originally designed to respond to. As I said before, it's been used in other circumstances, and I think those uses of power, even if for a good reason, like the Little Rock circumstance, I think those are justifiably something that we can ask ourselves, do we really think this was an appropriate use of this power? Was there really an insurrection going on in Little Rock? Well, arguably there was, because a state was openly defying a federal court order. Rodney King, hard to say, but in that case, California asked for it. So you see, each situation has to be examined on its own merits, but I think the classic case, the one that the act really and truly was designed for, was the secession crisis, the Civil War.
Professor Faizer, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Remember in 1861, one of the things that happened that was controversial is President Lincoln's unilateral suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, right? That's all these things I think are very unlikely to happen. I think we shouldn't go down the rabbit hole of assuming the worst of what will happen. I don't think the president will invoke the Insurrection Act. I don't think he will try anything like suspending the writ of habeas corpus. The real issue before us is we have to understand and respect that not all, and I think it's a very difficult thing for all of us, especially when dealing with protests some of us disagree with, is that the right to protest is the most American of activities. I mean, by the way, think of how few people feel comfortable to protest in Putin's Russia, right? And a protest is not synonymous with a riot. And I think that's extremely important for us to remember. in terms, and all of us have to be, regardless of political culture or ideology, receptive to people's First Amendment right to protest. Now, there's one limitation that is in the case law that is a legitimate limitation on the right to protest, which is the right to implement what are called reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on the right to peaceably assemble. So by way of example, you can't assemble and protest right outside someone's residential neighborhood at 11 p.m. at night to keep them from sleeping. It's legitimate for the municipality to say, by way of example, you can go to the public park, but within these hours to protest, as long as you're not doing so in a content-based manner. In other words, you don't say it's okay to support the president in the park, but it's not okay to criticize the president in the park, by way of example, right?
So as long as the permission is equally applied
That's
and
exactly
not
right.
restricted to content,
Yes.
that's
You can't, for example, welcome pro-Second Amendment protesters and disallow civil rights protesters, right?
okay. So
Vice versa.
as long as there's equal access to protest,
Yes,
it's
yeah.
fine.
And we have to be mindful, right? It's vice versa for liberals too, right? Because I think many liberals will see pro-Second Amendment protesters as insurrectionists, racists, illiberals, right? Let's be honest, and be tempted to suppress their speech, right? Or their message. So we have to recognize it applies, the intent is to be politically neutral.
Yeah,
The law is
I-
written to be politically neutral. Is that what I'm understanding?
The law is meant to be politically neutral, exactly.
Right. You can't discriminate, the government can't discriminate against speech on the basis of content. Recently, I've seen a lot of online comments, people wanting to ban the Ku Klux Klan, which I certainly understand. And I mean, implicit in that is that they don't want the Klan to march. But I tell you now that if the Klan decided they wanted to have a protest rally protesting against Black Lives Matter, and as long as they were peaceable, they have just as much right to do that as Black Lives Matter or their allies do. Professor Faizer is absolutely right that reasonable time, place, and manner descriptions are permissible as long as they're reasonable and content neutral. But here's an interesting contrast between law and policy. I mentioned Seattle before. Well, apparently a group of protesters there have essentially barricaded themselves in a couple of city blocks, and they're calling themselves, I don't know, the Seattle Capitol Hill Free Zone or something like that, and they're actually creating what looks like a 1960s era commune within that era, and doing what look like teach-ins and sit-ins and sing-alongs. And that's all fine, and it sounds very peaceable, except that they blocked off several city streets. Well, if the city of Seattle wanted to, I believe it could constitutionally go in and clear those barricades and arrest people who were blocking the streets. That's a manner restriction, and it's quite reasonable not to let protesters block city streets. However, the city of Seattle has decided as a matter of policy that it will be better for them to allow this protest to take place in this fashion, hoping that after a while, the protesters will feel they've had their say and that they'll go home. As a matter of policy, that's probably the wisest choice because you'll avoid violence that way.
And when we discuss policy, policy is set by the local level of government.
Mhm.
Again, I'm asking these questions for folks who may not be, again, in law school or within the legal profession.
Yes, I mean, it's always a government action that starts this, okay? There is no constitutional right until the government has done something bad to you. We call it the state action doctrine. A very good friend of mine is the former police chief of Charlottesville, Virginia. His name is Tim Longo. And he and I have had the honor of teaching a number of seminars for cops about the Constitution at James Madison's home, Montpelier. And one thing that Tim says throughout these seminars that really sticks in my mind is that the Constitution is a floor, not a ceiling. The Constitution mandates the minimum the government has to do to make sure it doesn't trample on our constitutional rights. But if a government like Seattle decides it wants to go beyond that and be even more permissive when it could restrict protest, that might be a very wise choice for them, even though it's not constitutionally mandated.
Professor Faizer, is there something you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that if I might, one of the probably the closest historical parallel I can see to this situation involving a president, and Stewart, you're the one who's got the coruscating knowledge of history, is the protest after Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. In the gap months between between the Hoover administration's end and the Roosevelt administration's inauguration, was how President Hoover treated the protesters who were protesting for their pensions as
Yeah.
veterans of World War I, right? And Stewart, can you remind us, what exactly did Hoover do? It was, in fact, the great General Douglas MacArthur in his early point in his career who was culpable for a great transgression on the First Amendment, right?
Yeah, if people are interested in this, it's a largely forgotten historical event, but it's very poignant, it's very frightening. It was 1932, an election year, and a number of World War I veterans, former American soldiers who just a few years earlier had marched along Pennsylvania Avenue to go off to war to defend democracy, well, they found themselves in very hard times. Think about that. If you're roughly 20 years old in 1920, then you're going to be roughly 30 years old in 1930. So these are young men, many of whom have families, at the depths of the Depression, and many of them are starving. They had been promised back right after World War I that they would get extra compensation to make up for the fact that as soldiers, they had made less than men who had stayed home and worked in war industries. So it was to rectify that imbalance that Congress promised these World War I veterans what came to be called a bonus. That's not a great word because it wasn't a bonus, it was compensation. But here's the catch. The bonus was not to be paid until 1945. Now, the bonus marchers needed that money, and they needed it right then, and so they went peacefully to Washington, D.C. from all over the country and petitioned Congress for a redress of their grievance. And they said, we want our money now. We need our money now. And there was debate in Congress, and ultimately Congress decided not to give them this money. At which point some people, small groups of them, started acting more aggressively, but it was really the overreaction by the United States military, specifically by Douglas MacArthur, that led to a march by the cavalry of the United States, accompanied by infantry and tanks, who cleared Pennsylvania Avenue of these bonus marchers, who herded them toward the bridge across the Anacostia River. And on the opposite side of that river, in mudflats, and not a very nice area, that is the primary encampment that these bonus marchers had. And it was pitiable. It was shacks. These are poor people with almost nothing. And their children and their wives are over there, and MacArthur just orders an attack. And he clears out this place, and people are getting trampled under horses. They're running away. There's huge fires. He burns the whole place to the ground. And here's the most poignant part of the whole tale. Back in World War I, MacArthur had been saved by an enlisted man who received, I think, maybe a Medal of Honor or some other decoration for having saved MacArthur's life. That man saw Douglas MacArthur there burning down the camp, and he tried to approach him and ask for his help and his sympathy. And MacArthur wouldn't even acknowledge his presence. He said, take that man away. The man who had saved his life. And this led Franklin Roosevelt to declare that Douglas MacArthur was the most dangerous man in America. And he was probably right. But that bonus march and the horrible results of it did contribute to Herbert Hoover's historic loss in the 1932 election, even though the evidence indicates that Hoover was at worst guilty of not controlling MacArthur rather than ordering him in. And that's why I say again, that when these things happen, and they have happened in our history, the remedy is the ballot box. If you see a president doing it, please.
We have a question from one of our participants who's asking, Maxine Waters says, what is going on should be called an insurrection. Do statements like that from people of her caliber on the side of the protests matter in terms of the validity of using the act?
Okay, Maxine Waters is the Democratic congressman, correct?
Yeah, she's the Los Angeles, the Watts
Right.
congressman from inner city Los Angeles.
So she, who is on the side of the Black Lives Matter movement, for some reason has described them as an insurrection. That's probably not politically wise. I don't know exactly why she said that, but that fact itself would not justify this calling something an insurrection that isn't one for purposes of the Insurrection Act. And again, I don't think anybody in a position of authority over this should see it that way. But the act itself gives the president the unilateral power to basically issue a cease and desist order, and if it's not obeyed, to send in the troops. And so ultimately, at least in the short term, the only opinion that matters on whether something's an insurrection or not is the president's. And then ultimately, the only opinion that matters is the people of the United States at the next election, whether they agree with what the president did.
If I could just speak on one thing, maybe in sympathy with Congresswoman Waters, I tend to agree with Stewart about his analysis. His complete legal analysis is perfect, spot on. And also I tend to agree with him on the domestic politics too, in terms of maybe it's certainly she's entitled to say that it may not be the wisest thing. But I think one thing that I think sometimes the majority group of white Americans sometimes I think misperceive when there are protests by racial minorities, and I recognize I'm a racial minority, I'm not an African American, is the great vulnerability minorities feel in the sense that our objection to policy, right, is never dispositive. In other words, it's disempowering sometimes for minorities to feel they have to protest to win the sympathy of open-minded whites to form a majority to protect their rights. And I think it's what King understood better than anybody. That's why he stood on the side always of nonviolence. That's why he tried to invoke the federal government vis-a-vis the several states. But at the same time, I think I would just ask those of you who are non-minorities to acknowledge how potentially traumatic it can be, right? To sort of make a choice, and even if you know you're right on a position, to recognize that your numbers are insufficient to prevail public policy-wise in the laboratory of democracy that we call the United States, right? And I think, to give you an example, right, 90% of African Americans rejected President Trump as their president, right? Well, guess who's the president, right? And that can be quite traumatic, right? Take the flip side. President Obama won the White House, but he needed to get at least 40% of the white vote, and he needed to get, in very key states, a majority of the white vote to get an electoral college majority, right? And so I think sometimes in many white Americans, in their just good faith, good-heartedness, in their openness to minority rights, sometimes white Americans, we as minorities, we sometimes feel a level of trauma recognizing we're relatively disempowered by the fact that democracy is, at the end of the day, majority rule.
And that brings up another very important subject, and that is that the Supreme Court has recognized this throughout its history. In the very famous footnote 4 to the Caroline Products case in the early 20th century, the court mentioned that it was especially concerned about protecting the rights of what it called discrete and insular minorities. Discrete, D-I-S-C-R-E-T-E, not E-E-T, meaning separate minorities who are insular, who are in some fashion separated from the rest of society, whether willingly or not. And the court acknowledged that democracy doesn't work for those groups because they're never, ever going to be in a majority. And then, as Professor Faizer says, they're to some extent at the mercy of well-intentioned white people who are willing to go along with them. That's one of the inherent flaws of any democratic system, is that democracy doesn't necessarily equal justice. And that is why it's so important to have an independent federal judiciary that is cognizant of this and is willing to protect individual rights. I don't want to take us off topic here, but there's something very closely connected and very, very timely. Would you mind if I took a minute to talk about qualified immunity?
We've got about 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for our last couple of questions. But yes,
Please do.
Qualified immunity actually applies here.
Qualified immunity is a judicially created concept going back to 1982, in which the Supreme Court said that if you're a police officer, you're not immune from any sort of lawsuit someone might file against you. That would be absolute immunity. But you're going to get some protection because police officers have to make life and death split-second decisions. And the rule is basically this, that a police officer will be immune from even having to defend a lawsuit if what he was doing was done in good faith and did not violate, here's the key phrase, a clearly established constitutional right. The problem with qualified immunity, according to many critics, is that it's been applied too protectively toward the police. It's evolved into something that's effectively absolute immunity. And just 2 days ago, in a case called Jones versus, let me see, it was West Virginia, Martinsville, West Virginia, the Fourth Circuit Court of the United States Court of Appeals, not known for being a liberal circuit, sitting in Richmond, considered a case of where 5 police officers surrounded a black man who was lying prostrate on the ground, unmoving, and emptied 27 bullets into him. And then those police officers' lawyers made the argument, well, there's no case specifically saying that that violates his constitutional rights. And the court said in a remarkably eloquent closing paragraph, something that I will share with you, and then I will let you go on to something else. In the closing paragraph of this 21-page opinion, the court concludes this way: Wayne Jones was killed just over 1 year before the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of Michael Brown would once again draw national scrutiny to police shootings of black people in the United States. 7 years later, we are asked to decide whether it was clearly established that 5 officers could not shoot a man 22 times as he lay motionless on the ground. Although we recognize that our police officers are often asked to make split-second decisions, we expect them to do so with respect for the dignity and worth of black lives. Before the ink dried on this opinion, the FBI opened an investigation into yet another death of a black man at the hands of police, this time George Floyd in Minneapolis. This has to stop.
Mm. I mean, that's compelling reading, right? And Ms.
Very.
Nichols, I think one thing that I think is a message that the protesters, I think, are trying to bring forth to us is we are living in a society that is dealing with the historical legacy of hundreds of years of slavery, right? And then after that slavery, we had segregation. And then after the segregation, there was the intentional denial of economic opportunity to people of color. And we live now in a society that has the cultural consequence of that, and definitively the economic consequences of that, which in turn then feed all of us, even well-intentioned people of all colors. It creates an implicit bias in all of us, right? And I think what the protesters, I think it's a cautionary thing for all of us to recognize is we as a society have to devote real resources beyond merely good intentions and emotional sympathy to remedying the consequences of this, right? And I think how we do this, it's going to require all of us to devote time, resources, but also I think we have to have a dialogue as to how to effectuate this. You know, how do we bring about a level of socioeconomic and cultural equality for all Americans, and therefore engender a level of national cohesion, which, let's be honest, all of us want, regardless if we're elephants or donkeys, right?
Correct. Now, just to make sure, again, for our audience, what you're referring to is systematic and systemic racism that's built into the culture of our society, and that's specifically what we need to address.
Exactly.
Yep, that's actually, I believe, what people mean, people on the left who are calling to so-called, quote-unquote, defund the police. I think only the most extreme people think they actually want to abolish police departments, which, in my personal opinion, is an extraordinarily bad idea. I think what more reasonable people who use that phrase are meaning is what you're talking about. Take away some of what they see as the excessive funding of especially military-style equipment in the police, and take that funding and shift it into areas that are going to address some of the underlying socioeconomic problems that ultimately lead to these conflicts. So they're talking about a reallocation of funding. As a policy matter, you know, that's fine. We can debate that policy. I do suggest, however, that they have not picked the best phrase to make their case. It's being distorted by their opponents. And again, online, I read somebody who's trying to get the expression changed to invest in justice. And I think that really captures more what Professor Faizer was saying, and also I think what the goals of the people on that side of the debate are.
Thank you very much. As part of this series, we intentionally set out to have as part of this, the last thing that we do is something that we can do as individuals in our pursuit of equity and diversity and justice, an individualized action that we can take. And so in response to that, we are asking, how does filming government activity intersect with the First Amendment? And then follow that with, if people are engaged in protesting government action and they're detained by the police, what's the best course of action for them to take? And Professor Harris, you spoke to that earlier during this event. But if we could just start with filming government activity and then maybe move on to what individual actions that we can take.
As long as you are not interfering with the police in the performance of their official duties, you have every right to film them. The rule that has been developing is that there's a certain zone around a police officer, especially when interacting with the public, roughly 10 feet. If you're 10 feet away, that means that you can't physically reach the police officer or interfere with what he or she is doing. And if you're at least that far away, in all likelihood, you have a protected First Amendment right to film everything. Think about this. These are your employees. You are monitoring their performance of their public duties on your behalf. Mm-hmm. So you have every right to film them. And you should keep filming right up until that police officer takes the camera out of your hand, and you should have somebody else filming him doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Faizer?
I agree with what Professor Harris is saying. I would say, though, the ideal true north, though, is that the police are able to, we can have with a level of social trust in our interactions with the police. And I think one thing that we have to be mindful of is when we're constantly being filmed, we tend to not be quite as effectively communicative, right? Imagine, for example, I had you in my office, Ms. Maples, going over a midterm, and I knew the dean was watching a video cam of our interactions, right? I probably would communicate with you less warmly or less openly and discuss things with you in a less sort of amicable way. And I think that's the risk we run. Is I think what the real reality, if you look at racial minority communities in this country, is they are, for historical and lack of historical reasons and lack of economic opportunities, they tend to be higher crime communities, which are also hyper-policed in a violent sense, but under-policed from a communitarian framework, right? And I think ideally we can reverse that there actually will devote resources to give adequate community policing to distressed neighborhoods and not hyper-vigilant physical enforcement policing that they currently suffer, right? And in a strange way, when we use cameras all the time, it could lead to and further the adversarial cultural framework that the police operate under in minority neighborhoods.
So in our last few moments, is there anything either of you would wish to add about this conversation where we discuss the intersection of government actors and the First Amendment?
Well, I would say that we've been concentrating a lot on those issues and on the protests themselves, and we've emphasized that peaceful protesters have every right to do so. And I certainly wouldn't discourage anybody from that. But far more importantly, get out the vote on November the 3rd. Vote yourself, make sure you're registered, make sure that your like-minded friends will do it, because that's the ultimate check on any government abuse of power. And I'm afraid that a lot of very dedicated people who might get very excited about going out and chanting in the streets, and I'm not denigrating that, but who might get very excited by the novelty of this and the inherent excitement of participating in a protest, will not be so motivated to stand in line on November the 3rd. And that is ultimately far more important.
And I would, if I could add, I think we are, though, a large private sector economy and with a relatively limited footprint government. And that's the reality of American society. And so I think we also can't go so far as to blame the entirety of the problems facing racial minority communities on the police. The police tend to be the frontline actors quite often, and clearly that there should be no room for what happened to George Floyd. But those of us in the private sector, those of us who are non-government workers, we should be asking ourselves, what are the things we're doing over the days, weeks, and months of our lives to foster economic minority opportunity for historically excluded American citizens who contributed so much to our country, right? So the question I have to ask myself is, what am I doing? What am I doing as a professor, as a private citizen, to provide and increase the opportunities afforded to my fellow American citizens of color? Right? And I think that's the question we should really also be asking ourselves, and not saying that the entire blame for social exclusion lies with the police.
Thank you, Professor Faizer. We have approximately